You guys go ahead and pass those. We're ready to go. Before we get into the message, I need to answer the question that is on everybody's mind, the most pressing question, the thing you've been worried about all week, and we're anxiously awaiting to come to Maury Hills this morning to find out the answer to this question. I need to answer that for you. The dog is fine, okay? The dog is perfectly fine. She is running around. She's jumping on people. She's knocking over the garbage and scattering trash throughout the yard. She's barking at 5 in the morning. She's chewing up her bed. She's chewing up the back porch furniture. In other words, she is back to normal. So she is back to her demonic and destructive ways. There's a tiny part of me that hoped running over her would change her personality. I didn't do it on purpose. Okay? But I kind of hoped it would change her personality just a little bit. It didn't. She's totally fine, and she's completely back to normal. If anybody wants her, come see me after church, and I'll set you up with her. Last week I told a story about running over my dog, and you just have to go listen to it if you missed it. There was an audible gasp when I told that story. I think that's I've been preaching here nearly 15 years, and nobody's ever gasped at anything I've said until I talk about running over my dog, and it's like, our preacher's a demon. Anyway. Hidden Dragon, let's talk about this. This is our last day in the series. It's been 10 weeks that we've been in this series, and I want to start the last message where we started the first message, and it was this quote from Pete Scazzaro that said, "It's not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature." It's not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. This has kind of been on my mind as I've been writing these messages. This is the quote that's kind of been in my mind, because I think what he does is give language to something that we've all experienced in church before but couldn't really put our finger on. And that's when we have seen spiritually mature people, and I should probably put that in quotes, spiritually mature people act in emotionally immature ways. And I think some of that is because our definition of spiritual maturity is off just a little bit. I think we tend to think of spiritual maturity as somebody who has a lot of deep Bible knowledge. Somebody that really knows their Bible. That's a spiritually mature person. Well, that Bible knowledge doesn't necessarily correlate to spiritual maturity. Or we think, well, spiritual maturity is about somebody who prays a lot, or somebody who listens to Christian music, or who uses spiritual language, or who attends church on a regular basis, or somebody who's just been a Christian a long time. They've been a Christian for 35 years. They're spiritually mature. No, that's not really it. Spiritual maturity is involved like looking and acting more like Jesus. That's what spiritual maturity looks like. And Jesus was not only spiritually mature, but emotionally mature. And so what happens in church is we see people who are, quote, spiritually mature act in ways that don't reflect that. They refuse to apologize. They're hypercritical of others. They bully. They micromanage. They're not transparent with their struggles. They harbor resentment. They're jealous. They numb their feelings with porn or perfection or busyness or screens or whatever works. And that's just a few examples I jotted down. We've seen that in the church before, and the church has kind of said, hey, we don't want to deal with those things. Those are emotional issues. We'll leave those to the therapist, and we'll leave those to the psychologist. Let's deal with the spiritual issues. Well, emotional issues are spiritual issues, and I absolutely believe you need to go see a therapist. If you're wrestling with some emotional issues, go see a therapist, but it's going to make it a whole lot better if you take God with you when you go see the therapist. You don't separate those things. Emotional maturity and spiritual maturity are inseparable. We're talking about the same thing. And so we've been kind of leaning into that in this series specifically, but we're also talking about how do we lean into that more from just this series, because every time I do a series like this is the third one I've done. We did Beneath the Surface several years ago. We did one called Beautiful Peril, and this is the third series I've done that kind of talks about the intersection between spiritual maturity and emotional maturity. Every time I've done it, we've received a tremendous response from within the church and outside of the church. I've had people talking to me all throughout this series about, naming and taming their dragons, like owning their stuff, whatever it is that they're wrestling with. I've had them telling me about, hey, my wife and I, we had a conversation about resentment, and man, we needed to have that conversation 15 years ago, and we started having this conversation after the message. Or we had a conversation with my mother about anxiety, and man, we really needed to talk about that. Just this week, I had 2 people that I was trying to help connect with counselors. And we have counselors here at Maury Hills. That's one of the things we don't talk about enough, but Scott is here on staff, and he sees people on a limited basis when needed. Abby is here. She's not on staff, but she is working out of Murray Hills. So her office is the old nursery. We took the old nursery and turned that into Abby's office. Is it 2 days a week or 3 days a week? 2 days a week. Abby's here. You can go to abbyyutter.com and then you can make appointments through there. Stacy Jagger's in Spring Hill, and she's seeing people on Mondays at the Spring Hill office, which is in Neapolis, actually. So all of them offer discounts to Murray Hills members. So they do like a 50% type discount or something like that to Murray Hills members because this is important to us, and we know people need this. And these guys are Christian, godly counselors, and they're not separating emotional issues and spiritual issues. They're talking about emotional and spiritual issues. And so I'm thankful that we have that. Renee Leach did our Gifts of Imperfection workshop during this series. She had a small group that did that. She's a counselor here in town. She's a great person to talk to as well. There's tons of resources, is what I'm saying. If you need to talk to somebody, go talk to somebody. Call the church, and we'll help you get connected. If you don't want to talk to somebody here locally, you're like, well, I know Scott and Abby. I don't want to talk to them. I don't want them knowing my stuff. Okay, fine. They got good people in Nashville that they can refer you to. Go talk to somebody if you need to talk to somebody. And that's really what we're talking about today. Okay, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, so let me back up just a little bit, and let me ask the question that I want to try to answer today. As we've gone through this series, we've talked about tough issues. So we've talked about things like grief and anxiety and loneliness and shame and depression, envy, resentment, doubt. We've talked about some pretty heavy emotional topics, and it's all been focused on our struggles. So as we've talked about it, it's all been focused on what if I'm dealing with envy, or what if I'm dealing with depression? How do I deal with that? Or what if I'm dealing with grief? Now, one of the inevitable things that happens in a series like this, every time I've preached on it, it's happened. Sometimes we sit in the message and we're like, yeah, I need to hear that. That's a dragon of mine, and I need to hear that. And how do I help myself deal with that? But what also happens is we start thinking about the people we love. And if it's not our dragon, it's their dragon. And we start thinking, yeah, but okay, that's not a struggle of mine, but it is for this person in my family, or it is for this really close friend of mine, and I know that they're struggling, and I see that dragon growing in their lives, and I keep, what do I do there? Because even if it's not our dragon, it affects us. If it's not our dragon, but it's our spouse's dragon, it's not our dragon, but it's our kid's dragon, or it's our parents' dragon, or it's our friends, or it's our brother or sister's dragon, that still affects us. Especially the larger the dragon grows, the more it affects us, right? And so how do we deal with that? How do we help someone that we see is hurting, whether or not they can realize it's hurting them? I mean, because sometimes they're like Billy Bixby's mom, and they keep insisting there's no such thing as dragons. There's no such thing as dragons. This is not a problem for me. But we can clearly see it is a problem for them, and we see it filling up the living room, and we feel ourselves kind of going around and rearranging our lives around this because this dragon is having an effect on our relationships. So how do we help someone we love who's hurting themselves or hurting us or hurting others? That's anytime I preach this series, that question comes up. And I want to try to answer it in the next 15 minutes. And you say, well, how do you answer a question like that in 15 minutes? Well, you don't. Okay, I'm going to give you a few big broad principles here, but really we could have done a parallel series here. We could have spent 10 weeks talking about how to deal with these dragons in your life and 10 weeks talking about how to deal with these dragons in the lives of people you love. Because it's different when you talk about how to deal with depression in your life versus how to deal with depression in the life of somebody you love, or how to deal with shame in your life versus how to deal with shame in the life of somebody you love. So we could have spent the same amount of time talking about these issues. So I'm going to do the impossible here and just kind of put it into one message in hopes that it just kind of gets you thinking and gets you looking for the answers. If you need more specific kind of instructions on how to deal with this problem, that's what it gets you going for. So I'm going to share 3 ways with you real quick. And we're going to look at one Old Testament passage and one New Testament passage to try to answer this question. The Old Testament passage is in 1 Samuel chapter 12. As we've gone through the series, we've used Psalms of Lament. And the Psalms of Lament are mostly written by King David. And I've said throughout it, I've held like King David up as the example. Like, look at David. Look at what he wrote in the Psalms. He was very emotionally aware in the Psalms. So he owned his dragons, and he would say, God, where have you been? Why have you not rescued me? Why am I lonely? Why do my enemies prosper? So we've seen that, David is very emotionally honest before God. And we've said, that's good. That's exactly what you need to be. And so I would even say David had a lot of emotional intelligence. That just means he's aware of how he's feeling and why he's feeling that way. But we also know, because we've read David's story, that he's human. And because he's human, he has blind spots. And all of us have blind spots. We have certain things that we can't see. Although the other people around us may be able to see, this is a problem for him, but we can't see it. And David's was a pretty glaring blind spot that was brought to his attention in the 12th chapter here in 2 Samuel. I said 1 Samuel, I think. 2 Samuel. Here's what the story is around, if you're not familiar with David's story. When David was king, he used his position of power, because you can't refuse the king. So I don't think this relationship with Bathsheba is a consensual relationship. He used his position of power to sleep with Bathsheba. And she was the wife of Uriah, who was one of the warriors in David's army. And so after he did that, he then tried to manipulate Uriah into sleeping with her in order to cover his tracks because she got pregnant. And when that didn't work, he had Uriah killed. You want to talk about some big dragons in David's life. There's a balloon floating down in the middle of the room. I'm sorry, I got to stop for that. Thank you, Todd. That was a good save, Todd. Doesn't happen often, but we try to release balloons at least 2 or 3 times a year. Now, they had a big event in here last night with Zion Christian, and so there's still a few balloons on the ceiling. But anyway, what was I talking about? David's dragons. Lust, uncontrolled passions, lying, manipulation, deception. I mean, David had some big dragons in his life, and for once, he couldn't see them. This was a blind spot for David. He couldn't see them. And so the Lord sent Nathan, who was a prophet at the time of David, to him. And this is the story right here. So that's the setup for the story. The Lord sent Nathan to David, and when he came to him, he said, there were 2 men in a certain town, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, even slept in his arms. So Nathan's just kind of telling this story about a man who had everything and a man who had nothing. And the man who had everything took the one thing from the man who had nothing. And it's a parable about what David did to Uriah. Okay? And so Nathan's telling this story here, and in verse, 4 right there, 5, it gives David's reaction to the story. Because when David hears the reaction of a man who had everything using his power to take the one thing from the man who had nothing, he says, as surely as the Lord lives, what this man did, the one who did this must die. He burned with anger against this. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. And then Nathan said to him, David, you're the man. I'm talking about you. This is what you did. Now the principle here, like how do you help someone you love? The principle I'm looking at here is just simply this. Get this. Speak up. If there's somebody in your life that's hurting, their actions are hurting you, or they're hurting other people, or they're hurting themselves, you can't sit by and watch that happen and go, well, I hope something happens here. I hope they wake up. I hope they recognize it. You can't sit around and gossip with your friends about it. Can you believe what's going on with them? I can't believe it. You can't sit around and worry about it. If it's somebody you love and you've got a relationship with that person, you got to speak up. You have to say something to them. And no, that's not easy. I mean, in this story, David immediately repents. And this does not have to be around sin. This story is about sin. David had a specific sin. Nathan is calling him out about that sin. It may be that you're speaking up not about a specific sin, but about a struggle. You just see something going on in their life. It's not necessarily sin, but there's a struggle that you see going on. And so you speak up about that. And it doesn't always go as well as it did in David's story, because David repented. And he said, what was I doing? What was I thinking? I mean, he had an instant awakening. most of the time when you go talk to somebody in these types of situations, they do not have an instant awakening. Most of the time they're going to respond with frustration, or they're going to get angry about it, or they're going to have their feelings hurt that you came to talk to them in this way. But sometimes you got to have those hard conversations sometimes. You have to say the unsaid that's kind of living right there in the relationship, and you got to speak up and you say it, and you got to do it on a personal level. This is not something you text them. This is not something you Facebook message them. This is not something you email them. This is not a phone call. This is something where you have it, you say, can we go to coffee together? I want to talk about something. Can we sit down and talk about, like, we need to have a talk about something. And you do it not in a spirit of judgment and condemnation, not in a spirit of superiority, like I'm better than yours and my life's all together and yours is a mess and I'm going to tell you how to get that fixed. That's not what this is about. This is about just responding to someone with empathy. I mean, like Nathan had the courage to do that. Nathan had the courage to speak up. Do you think he wanted to go? You think he was excited to go and talk to a king who had just had another adversary of his killed and to say, David, there's some problems here that we need to talk about? And I'm sure Nathan's not looking forward to the conversation, but he had the courage to do it. And because he had the courage to do it, he stopped David from even a further downward spiral. But here's the second thing that I think Nathan did. I don't have that in the context, so I can't really say that, but we're going to jump to the New Testament for this principle. So the first thing is you just got to say something. If somebody you love is hurting, say something. Speak up. Talk to them about it, but do it in the right spirit, and that's where I want to go next. It's in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Galatians 6, Paul gives the same advice. He says, if someone you know is caught in sin, and I'll apply this, I think it applies not just to caught in sin, but caught in a struggle. If someone you know is hurting, and they're caught in a struggle, and you know it's going on, and you can see it, and it's, you got to speak up. And this is what he says. You who live by the Spirit should restore that person, but notice how you restore that person. Gently. This is not about vindication. This is not about giving them a good butt chewing. This is not about telling them what they're doing, and I'm going to set them straight, and I'm going to fix them. This is not about judgment. This is not about guilting them into doing what you want them to do. It's not about heaping more shame on them. This is about helping them become aware of whatever it is in their life that they need to become aware of, because they're not aware of it right now. It's a blind spot. So it's kind of trying to help them become aware of that, and the only way you can do that is if you respond with empathy. When you go speak with them, you speak with empathy, because this is where human connection comes from. And the New Testament talks about it as gently. Some versions say gently and with humility. Has anybody ever changed when you go to them with pride and arrogance, and I'm going to tell you how to fix your problems right now? What do we do when somebody comes to us like that? When somebody comes at us in attack mode, or somebody comes at us, pinning for an argument, or somebody comes at us, with the fist raised, how do we respond? We raise our fist. I mean, that's when we armor up, we get defensive, we go back to our corners, we retreat, we don't have anything to do with them. So I think, you have to have the relationship with that person to be able to have that conversation. And you respond with empathy when you do that. Empathy is just simply, let me find my definition here, the ability to recognize, perceive, and directly feel the emotion of another person. This is what Paul talks about. The very next verse, he describes empathy in chapter 2. Carry each other's burdens. And in this way, you'll fulfill the law of Christ. What is the law of Christ? To love your neighbor as yourself, to love your brother as yourself, to love your friend as yourself. And so he's just talking about empathy here. Carry each other's burdens. Weep with those who weep. Rejoice with those who rejoice. The best New Testament definition of empathy is right here. Hebrews chapter 13:3. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison. And those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. Empathy is putting yourself in another. It's kind of interesting. Envy is the direct opposite of that. But empathy is putting yourself in another's shoes, walking in their life for a little bit, trying to understand why they're feeling what they're feeling. You may not be able to connect with their experience. You may not be in prison, but you can connect with the feelings underneath the experience. You may not be able to experience, the mistreatment that they've suffered, but you can connect with the feelings underneath the experience. And so the best definition I've read from somebody, it may have been Brene Brown probably, but empathy is my pain in your heart, or it's your pain in my heart. And that's where human connection comes from. I think one of the things that made Nathan's confrontation of David so effective was that Nathan had a relationship with David. So it's somebody that David respected. It was somebody that David knew. It was a friend that was able to say, David, I'm talking about you, and that was the awakening point for David. If it's somebody that I don't know and they're just coming at me, I'm going to defend myself. But if it's somebody I know and somebody I respect and somebody who always connects with me out of empathy, I'm going to respond to that. I told the second service that one of those people that's been that, at least in here in Murray Hills, is Tim. Because Tim's called me out on a few things before. And when he's done it, he hadn't done it in this, kind of holier than thou attitude or coming, I'm going to show him. He's done it like, brother, I need to talk to you about something because there's something you did here that I don't think it was the right call, and I think maybe you need to do something a little different here. I suggest you need to do this. But he comes at me with empathy. I mean, one of the reasons that he's the campus pastor in Columbia now is because of that, because he's somebody I trust, and he's somebody I look to, and I value what his thoughts are on that, and so I'm willing to respond to that. And so that's the second piece here. If it's somebody you love and you're trying to help that person, you got to speak up. That's the hard part. It's tough to speak up because you don't know how they're going to react, and you can't control how they're going to react. So you have to speak up. But more importantly than even speaking up is show empathy. I would put it this way. If you can't speak up with empathy, don't speak up. If you're at a place, you're like, I can't go talk to him right now because I know how I'm going to respond when I talk to him, then you're not ready to talk to him. Just don't talk to him yet. You're not ready. You need to do some work on your heart before you go speak to them. Because if you got all this anger or resentment or bitterness kind of built up, and you know that when you speak you're not going to be able to show empathy to them, it's not going to do any good. It's going to be more destructive than helpful. Once you're ready to have some empathy and to show empathy, then you can help them. And here's the last piece. Okay, and this is tough too. You have to know your limits when you go have this conversation. You have to be able to set some boundaries. There's a verse I intentionally skipped. Where is it? Galatians 6:1. Will you flip that back for me, Spencer, if you can find it? Yeah, right here. Galatians 6:1, he says, brothers and sisters, if someone's caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person, so that's speak up. You should do it gently, that's with empathy. And then he says right there, but watch yourselves, or you yourselves may be tempted. And it's just a little word of caution, like, be careful. Know what your boundaries are, know what your limits are, know where they end and you begin. This is not about assuming all of their problems. I'm going to go in and I'm going to assume all of their problems. I'm going to assume all of their dragons. I'm going to take all of this off of them. That's not what it's about. You can't change other people. They have to change for themselves. You can help, guide through the process. Sometimes you can help, especially if you've been there. I mean, if you've been there and you've been in the same hole they've been in, you can say, hey, I can show you how to get out of here. But sometimes you haven't been in that hole. You don't know how to tell them how to get out of there. You don't even know what direction to go. That's where you got to know your limits. You got to know your boundaries. And you got to be able to say, I don't know what to do here, but I'll help you find out what to do. And that sounds like, but how's that helping them? Listen, sometimes that's the best help you can provide. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can say to somebody who's hurting is, I don't know what to do here either, but I'm willing to walk with you and help you figure it out. I say that to people a lot because people will come to, just from the nature of my position, people will come to me and tell me things that are going on in their life, and I don't always know what to do. I don't have the answers for them. They'll tell me about some situation they're dealing with in their family or at work or whatever, and like, what do you think? What do I need to do? What do I need to do? And there's a lot of times that I'll say, I don't know. I don't know, but I know somebody who would. So can we make a phone call together, or can you give me just a minute and let me kind of look this up and find their contact? I got a drawer right by my computer full of counselors' cards in there. And I can go and refer some of those. I can walk right across the hall there to Scott and say, Scott, here's the situation going on. Who do you know that could help with something like this? And that's just about knowing when you're out of your league. Like, I don't know how to respond to this. I haven't dealt with this before. I don't know what to do here. So rather than me trying to fix it, well, I'll tell you what you need to do. You need to do this. Rather than me trying to fix it, I refer them. There's nothing wrong with asking for professional help. Nothing wrong with it. Matter of fact, there's a lot that's right with it. Sometimes the best way you can help somebody is you just sit with them while they make the appointment. Like, I'm just going to sit right here. Let's make the phone call. Let's make the appointment together right now. Come on. If you need me to make the phone, give me your phone. I'll call the number if you want. I'll drive you over there. How can I help? I'll watch your dog while you're gone for the week. Whatever it is that they need help with, I'm willing to kind of help you get through this, because this goes back to that middle piece right there. This is about empathy. Carry each other's burdens. And in this way, you fulfill the law of Christ. So how I wanted to wrap up today's message was I wanted to ask you to get your phones. And originally I had this in here as like, open up your notes section and put a couple of numbers down in your notes section. But in the first service, a lot of people were just taking pictures, and that's probably an easier way to do it. If you just pull out your phone and take a picture of that screen right there, or put it in your notes, okay? And all this is just a few phone numbers of, if you get in a situation with somebody and you're not real sure how to handle it, this is a place that you could call. Now, you could call the church, but we don't answer the phone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These guys do. So whenever it happens, you got somebody that you can reach out to. Like that National Suicide Prevention, that hotline, we think, well, I'm not going to need that because I haven't had any suicidal thoughts. That's not it's not just for people having those kinds of thoughts. It's also for people who are trying to help those having those kind of thoughts. If you've got a family or a friend or something, and they're saying things that are concerning to you, or they're acting in ways that are concerning to you, and you're like, I'm really worried about them, you can call that number and say, hey, what do I do? Here's the situation. I've called that number several times. I called that number one time, and they said, what you need to do is hang up from us right now and call the police, and they're going to do a welfare check. And I'm glad I did, because the guy was unconscious when they got there. And he said, you right now, hang up the phone, call the police. Another time I called, they said, no, it's not time to call the police. This is you need to kind of talk through them with a few of these things, encourage them to do this. This is kind of the next step. So, I've used these numbers before to just call and say, hey, how do I handle this problem? I don't know how to handle this problem. This is, what do I do here? And they've got great advice there. That bottom, when there is a text line, you don't even have to call. You can text your question. If you're wrestling with some kind of mental something or emotional something, you can just text that 741, text them a question, and they've got somebody that'll respond 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's just some ways to, like, we should be ready and have those things. We can't ignore when people give us the warning signs. We can't ignore them. It happens too often, and we ignore them. So we have to be able to try to respond to that. And the last thing I'll tell you, and we're going to pray and be dismissed. Sometimes you do all you can do, and that's it. It's not always, I can't, like when I put that up there, where is that? I don't want you to sit in here and go, okay, speak up, show empathy, and know your limits. Well, if I do that, then the person I love they'll be fine. Not always. That's out of our control. That's not within our control. We don't control other people. And that's sometimes the dragon is too large, and it just has too much of a grip, and you just can't do anything. That's just reality. Okay, it's a painful reality, but it's reality, and that's because we live in a broken world, and we live in a world of sin, and we live in a fallen world, and we're looking forward to the day, as Scott talked about we're looking forward to the day when our consciences are completely cleaned and our world is completely restored and renewed, and we don't deal with this stuff anymore. There will be no series on hidden dragons in heaven. We won't have to do series like this in heaven. There won't be like, Apostle Peter won't say, well, let's talk about shame today, and let's figure out how we can help one another deal with our shame. There's no shame in heaven, or anxiety, or loneliness, or despair, or envy, or resentment. That's what we're looking forward to. Let's pray together. Father, this is this is the hardest topic, I think, to deal with in many ways. Because when we see someone we love engaging in destructive behavior or thoughts or those things, it scares us and it hurts us because we can't control them. We just can't. And so it's hard to talk about these things, and I understand that. And I pray that you help us to continue to put our trust in you, continue to put our hope in you, and ask you to deliver us from this world we live in. It's a crazy world, and help us to deliver. Help us to create a safe place here at Murray Hills for people who are wrestling with things like this, a safe place where they feel that judgment ends and healing begins. That they feel like they can come here and it's okay to say, hey, I'm wrestling with this, or hey, this is a struggle for me. And it's okay to admit those things, and they can begin a process of healing here at this church. And I pray for anybody that's sitting today or watching online right now, and they're thinking about having that tough conversation. I pray your Spirit be with them, give them the courage to have that, give them the right words, and to be in the right place themselves, emotionally and spiritually, to be able to do that. It's in your Son's name we pray these things. Amen. All right, we'll see you guys next Sunday.